She was talking to his grave. She didn't know he was standing close enough to hear every word. Behind the old yew trees, 30 paces back, a man the world believed was dead held his breath and listened to a woman say what she had never said to his face. Eleanor Ashford knelt on damp earth, her dove-grey pelisse soaking through at the knees, and she didn't care. The worn, leather-bound prayer book pressed against her chest like a shield, both hands wrapped around it, knuckles white, as if letting go meant letting go of something else entirely. The tortoise-shell comb in her honey-blonde hair had slipped. One loose wave fell across the faint birthmark below her left ear. Rain had come and gone an hour ago, leaving the churchyard smelling of moss and turned soil, and the gravestone was still dark with wet. She spoke to it the way you speak to someone who owes you an answer. "I never told you." Her chin lifted, that particular lift, the one that made her look braver than she felt. "Not once. I read to your mother every morning for 6 weeks. I sat in your library. I walked your garden, and I never once said." Her voice cracked. The dimple on her right cheek appeared and vanished, not from smiling, from pressing her lips together to hold something in. "You were the only person who ever listened to me, like what I said mattered. And I let you disappear without telling you that." The prayer book lowered to her lap, her pale green eyes fixed on the name carved into stone. She touched the letters with her fingertips, slow, deliberate, the way you trace something you're trying to memorize before it's taken from you. And 30 feet behind her, half hidden by the yew tree at the churchyard's edge, a man in a charcoal greatcoat stood perfectly still. His left hand hung at his side. The heavy gold signet ring caught no light. The sky was too grey for that. But his thumb turned it, slowly, again and again. If you want to understand why a duke would fake his own death, you need to understand what he heard her say. But first, how she came to be at his grave at all. 6 weeks earlier. The hired carriage was not a good one. The springs protested every rut in the road, and the road to Thornfield Park had many. Eleanor sat with the letter of employment in her reticule and her prayer book under her left arm, and watched the countryside slide past rain-streaked glass in long grey strokes. Fields giving way to forest. Forest giving way to an iron gate that appeared so suddenly she didn't have time to straighten her posture before the carriage was through it. Then the house. Thornfield Park announced itself the way only old money can. Not with beauty, exactly, but with scale. 3 stories of pale limestone darkened by decades of English weather. 42 windows across the front facade, and Eleanor counted them because counting kept her hands from shaking. The drive curved through an avenue of elms whose branches met overhead like the ribs of a cathedral, and beyond the gravel sweep at the front steps, visible even through the rain, a rose garden. Or what had been one. The beds were overgrown. Canes sprawled unpruned, some dead, some throwing out wild new growth with no one to shape it. A garden that had lost the person who loved it and had been waiting ever since. The carriage did not stop at the front entrance. It continued around to the east side, past the kitchen garden wall, to a plainer door set into plainer stone. The servants' entrance. Eleanor understood. She was not a guest. She was staff. A reader, a companion, something between a governess and a piece of furniture. She gathered her single trunk and stepped out onto wet gravel and did not look back at the front of the house, because looking back would mean wishing she'd arrived differently. The door opened before she knocked. Mrs. Graves stood in the frame, silver grey hair pulled into that tight, low bun, brass-rimmed spectacles reflecting the flat afternoon light, the ring of iron keys at her waist clinking once as she shifted her weight. Her pale blue eyes moved over Eleanor with the efficiency of someone who has evaluated 100 new arrivals and found most of them wanting. "Miss Ashford." Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes, Ma'am." Mrs. Graves tilted her head, that particular tilt measuring, and stepped aside. "Wipe your boots. The corridor floors were waxed this morning." Through corridors, then, past closed doors and the smell of beeswax and coal smoke and something faintly floral, lavender maybe, dried and tucked into linen closets. The house was quiet the way large houses are quiet, not silent, but holding its sounds close. A clock somewhere, the distant percussion of someone in a kitchen, their footsteps on stone, then wood, then carpet. Mrs. Graves stopped at a door and knocked twice, softly, then opened it without waiting for a reply. The morning room. East-facing windows letting in what grey light the afternoon still offered. A fire burning low. And in a high-backed chair near that fire, Lady Constance Ashworth, the Dowager Duchess of Thornfield, sat with her spine perfectly erect, her white hair swept up and pinned with a jet comb, the ivory cameo at her throat catching the firelight. One hand rested on the arm of her chair. The other held a bone-handled lorgnette, and she raised it now, those sharp hazel eyes magnified and merciless behind the lens. She looked at Eleanor the way a jeweler looks at a stone before deciding whether to cut it or discard it. One question. That was all she asked. "Do you read with feeling, or do you read like a clerk?" Eleanor's shoulders drew inward, just slightly, just for a moment. Then her chin lifted. She set her prayer book on the side table. She took the volume Mrs. Graves indicated, a collection of verse already open to a marked page, and she read. The poem was Cooper. Something about evening and quiet fields. Eleanor's voice filled the room the way water fills a glass, completely, without spilling. Not theatrical, not performed, just present. Each word given exactly its weight, no more, no less. When she finished, Lady Constance lowered the lorgnette, said nothing, turned her gaze to the fire. Mrs. Graves touched Eleanor's elbow and guided her back into the corridor, pulled the door shut with a soft click. "She didn't say anything," Eleanor whispered. Mrs. Graves looked at her over those brass-rimmed spectacles, the faintest shift at the corner of her thin, pressed lips, not quite a smile, but close enough. "No," she said. "She didn't." That, Eleanor would learn, was the highest possible compliment. 6 weeks before a gravestone. 6 weeks before words spoken to cold stone that were never meant to be heard by anyone living. It began here, on a grey morning when a hired carriage turned through iron gates and a woman with flower-dusted memories and a prayer book tucked under her arm saw Thornfield Park for the first time through rain-streaked glass and thought only, "I hope the library is warm." The rain had not stopped by morning. It drummed against the east-facing windows of the morning room with a patience that suggested it had nowhere else to be, and Eleanor Ashford stood in that room at 7:30, her honey-blonde waves half-pinned with the tortoiseshell comb, her pale green eyes tracking the way grey light moved across the floorboards like something alive. The morning room was small, 8 paces by 10, with faded blue wallpaper and a writing desk positioned precisely where the first light would fall. Someone had chosen that placement with care years ago, and no one had moved it since. Mrs. Graves appeared in the doorway,
the iron keys at her brass chain clinking once as she shifted her weight.
Pale blue eyes behind those small, round, brass-rimmed spectacles assessed Eleanor without hurry. She did not ask if Eleanor had slept well. She said, "The library is through the long corridor, second door past the staircase. Lady Constance takes her reading at 9. The fire will already be lit. It is always too hot in that room, but her ladyship feels the cold. You will learn not to mind." That was it. No tour, no ceremony, just the geography of a life delivered in practical sentences. And Eleanor learned Thornfield the way she learned everything, by walking it, by touching its walls, by being present inside its rhythms until they became her own. The library was exactly as Mrs. Graves described. Too warm, the fire built up past any reasonable point, the air thick with the smell of old leather and wood smoke. 2 walls of books from floor to ceiling. A reading chair positioned near the window, where Lady Constance sat each morning, slender and erect, white hair pinned with the jet comb, one hand resting on the chair's arm, the other holding the bone-handled lorgnette she never seemed to actually need. The kitchen garden lay beyond the south door, a walled square of herbs and root vegetables, well tended, practical. Eleanor began walking it at dawn on the second morning. Sturdy brown leather half-boots visible beneath her hem, the worn prayer book tucked under her left arm from habit rather than devotion, shoulders drawn slightly inward against the early chill. The gravel crunched beneath her feet in a rhythm that pleased her. No one asked why she walked. No one suggested she shouldn't. Her routine settled within 3 days like sediment in still water. 2 hours each morning reading to Lady Constance. Poetry, mostly, and essays, and occasionally letters from old friends that the Dowager could no longer read herself without the lorgnette trembling in her grip. Then walking. Then letters home to her widowed aunt in the village. Precise letters, warm but never sentimental, written at the desk in the morning room where the light came in from the east. The household whispered, as households do. The Duke had been in London for months. Parliamentary business, they said. Obligations. The kind of word that means someone is doing something they do not enjoy because no one else will do it. Thornfield ran in his absence with the smooth, slightly hollow precision of a clock that no longer needs winding. Every mechanism functioning, every hour marked, but no one listening for the chime. Mrs. Graves watched Eleanor. Not obviously, never obviously, but with that tilted head, those pressed, thin lips, the measured pace that never hurried toward judgment. She watched Eleanor learn every servant's name by the second day. Watched her thank the kitchen maid by name when tea arrived. Watched her carry her own breakfast plate back to the kitchen without being asked, and not make a performance of it. On the 4th morning, Eleanor found the rose garden. It lay beyond the south wall of the kitchen garden, through a wooden gate whose latch had rusted half shut. The roses had been magnificent once. You could see it in the bones of the beds, the iron arches meant for climbing varieties, the careful spacing that spoke of someone who understood light and soil and patience. But they had been neglected. 2 years, perhaps 3. The beds were choked with couch grass. Dead canes stood brown and brittle where they should have been pruned back in autumn. Eleanor did not ask permission. She simply returned the next morning in her second-best dress, the dove-grey wool pelisse over cream muslin, and began pulling weeds. Thorns caught her sleeves. Soil worked beneath her fingernails. The faint birthmark on the left side of her neck disappeared beneath a smear of garden dirt. She did not notice. She did not care. No one told her to stop. No one told her to continue. She simply did it, the way she did everything, because it needed doing, and she was there, and her hands were capable. Lady Constance mentioned her son on the 6th day. Not directly. The Dowager never said anything directly if she could help it. They were in the library, the fire too hot, as always. Eleanor reading from a collection of letters by a bishop whose name she'd already forgotten. Lady Constance raised the lorgnette, though she was looking at nothing in particular. The ivory cameo brooch at her throat caught the firelight. "He carries the estate like a penance." Eleanor's reading stopped. Her pale green eyes lifted. The single, shallow dimple appeared on her right cheek as she waited. "His father left him the title and nothing else. No joy, no instruction on how to bear it." The hazel eyes were sharp, focused somewhere past the bookshelves. Then Lady Constance lowered the lorgnette and gestured for Eleanor to continue. Nothing more, no explanation. The moment closed like a door. Eleanor returned to Cooper that afternoon. The library door stood half open. It always stood half open, because Lady Constance insisted the corridor draught kept the room from becoming unbearable. Eleanor read with her chin lifted slightly, her voice steady and unhurried, finding the meter of the verse without forcing it. She read the way some people breathe, naturally, without performance, as if the words moved through her rather than from her. 11 minutes passed. She became aware of it gradually, not a sound exactly, but a presence. A weight in the air beyond the half-open door. A tall shadow, motionless in the corridor, listening. She did not stop reading. She did not look up. The following morning, the fire in the library was already built up when Eleanor arrived. Not smouldering, not the dying embers of yesterday's warmth nursed back by a careless maid. This was a fire laid with intention. Split oak, banked perfectly, the kind of blaze that said someone had been here an hour ago and wanted the room warm for whoever came next. And on the reading table, a volume of verse. Open. Spine pressed flat against the dark wood as if weighted there by a careful hand. A specific page, a specific passage. Eleanor set her worn, leather-bound prayer book beside it and leaned close, her pale green eyes tracking the lines. The poem was about solitude, not the lonely kind, but the kind that becomes a country you inhabit so long you forget there was ever another. And then, in the final stanza, a turn, a door opening, a hearth lit in a room you thought abandoned. Homecoming. That was the word the poet used, not arrival. Homecoming. She read it aloud to Lady Constance that afternoon, the Dowager Duchess settled in her chair by the east window, with her ivory cameo catching the grey light. Eleanor's voice moved through the stanza with that unhurried clarity she always brought to the page, not performing, just letting the words exist in the air between them. When she finished, she looked up. Lady Constance's sharp hazel eyes were fixed on something beyond the window. Her thin lips curved, barely, almost imperceptibly, into something that was not quite a smile. She said nothing. She raised her bone-handled lorgnette, examined a thread on her plum silk cuff, and let the silence stand. That silence said everything. Now, here is where the house itself began to shift. No announcement had come, no letter preceded by a rider, no word from the steward or the London secretary. But that evening, a charcoal wool greatcoat hung in the entrance hall, heavy, brushed, smelling faintly of rain and road dust. Below it, tall, polished black riding boots set precisely together on the stone floor, mud still drying on the heels. The Duke of Thornfield was home. He did not appear at dinner. His place was not laid. The house absorbed his return the way a lake absorbs a stone. A ripple, then stillness, then the knowledge that something beneath the surface had changed. The maids moved differently. The footmen checked the decanters twice. A fire was lit in the east study that had been cold for 3 months. Mrs. Graves found Eleanor the next morning, in the corridor outside the kitchen, the housekeeper's ring of iron keys clinking softly at her brass chain as she approached. Her silver-grey hair was pulled tight in its low bun, her pale blue eyes steady behind those small, round, brass-rimmed spectacles. "His Grace is home," she said. The words were perfectly flat, perfectly measured. "He keeps odd hours. You will not be disturbed." That was all. She inclined her head and moved on, her sensible black boots making no sound on the flagstone. But Eleanor caught it. The careful neutrality. The deliberate absence of warmth or warning. As if Mrs. Graves were drawing a line on a map and saying, "Here is the border, and you need not concern yourself with what lies beyond it." Eleanor did not concern herself. She went about her evening as she always did, reading in the small sitting room adjacent to the library, her tortoise-shell comb holding back the honey-blonde waves that perpetually threatened escape, her cream muslin dress soft against the worn velvet of the chair. The hour grew late. The house settled into its particular nighttime language of cooling beams and contracting stone. And then, footsteps. Above her, in the library directly overhead. The slow, deliberate stride of someone tall. A chair creaking as weight settled into it. The whisper of a page turning. Eleanor's hands stilled on her own book, her chin lifted. She listened, the way you listen to rain when you cannot see the sky, tracking the rhythm, measuring the weight of each sound. Another page. The faint tap of something against wood. A ring, perhaps, turned absently on a finger. She did not go up. She did not call out. She sat in the corridor of sound between them and let the moment exist without naming it. Then she closed her book, tucked her prayer book under her left arm, and went to bed. Morning came soft and grey, the kind of English morning that refuses to commit to either rain or shine. Eleanor was in the rose garden by 8, a basket over her arm, her sturdy brown leather half-boots sinking slightly into the damp earth between the beds. The roses here had been neglected. Anyone could see that. But neglect in a rose is not death. It is merely an invitation to be remembered. She worked with quiet purpose, cutting stems at an angle the way her mother had taught her, selecting blooms that were open but not yet blown. Her ribbon, the one meant to hold back the left side of her hair, had come undone again and now trailed against her shoulder. A smudge of garden mud marked her right cuff. The faint birthmark on her neck below her left ear was visible where her hair had fallen forward. She did not know she was observed. From the upper window of the east study, behind glass that caught the morning's uncertain light, a figure stood with one hand clasped behind his back. But that is a detail Eleanor would not learn until much later, and we will leave it where it belongs. In the silence of a man watching someone who does not know she is watched. What Eleanor knew was this. The path curved around the yew hedge, and she was carrying 12 roses in a basket that was slightly too full, and the gravel was uneven here where the gardener had not raked since autumn. She turned the corner. He was simply there. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark chestnut hair curling slightly at his collar, grey-blue eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. The charcoal greatcoat, the squared jaw, the heavy gold signet ring catching light on his left hand. Eleanor stumbled. The basket tilted. Roses scattered across the gravel path like offerings thrown before an altar no one had prepared. "You might announce yourself," she said, sharp and immediate, her pale green eyes flashing. "Rather than appearing like a spectre in one's path."
One beat of silence. His dark brows lifted, just slightly. The cleft in his chin deepened as something shifted in his expression. And then Eleanor saw it. The signet ring. The posture. Military straight, deliberate, belonging. The way the garden belonged to him because everything here belonged to him. The slow recognition moved through her like cold water. This was not a servant. This was not a guest. This was the Duke of Thornfield, and she had just scolded him in his own garden. The curtsy came too late and far too deep, the kind of curtsy a woman makes when her body has already betrayed her mind, when shame arrives 3 full seconds after the words she cannot take back. Eleanor's knees bent so low her basket tilted, and 2 more roses tumbled onto the gravel path between them. Her pale green eyes fixed somewhere around his 3rd waistcoat button. The tortoiseshell comb in her honey-blonde hair caught the morning light as she bowed her head, and the birthmark below her left ear flushed pink against her fair skin. The Duke of Thornfield did not move. He stood there, military straight spine, one hand clasped behind his back, the other hanging at his side where his thumb turned the heavy gold signet ring in one slow rotation. His grey-blue eyes tracked the fallen roses on the ground. Then he bent, unhurried, and picked up the nearest one. A cream-coloured thing, half-opened, its stem still wet from where she'd cut it. He held it out to her without meeting her eyes. "You were right," he said. The words came low, barely louder than the breeze through the box hedges. "I was standing precisely where I ought not to have been." That was it. Not anger, not the sharp dismissal of a man accustomed to deference. Something closer to amusement lived in the set of his mouth, a flicker at one corner, gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. The small, dark mole at the outer corner of his right eyebrow seemed to punctuate the expression, like a period at the end of a sentence she couldn't quite pass. Eleanor took the rose. Her fingers did not touch his. She managed something, a murmur, a fragment of apology, and then she was walking quickly back toward the kitchen door, the basket clutched against her dove-grey pelisse, her sturdy brown half-boots crunching too fast on the gravel. She did not look back. He did not call after her. The kitchen swallowed her. Stone walls, copper pans catching the low fire, the smell of bread proving in its cloth-covered bowl. Eleanor set the basket down with hands that would not steady themselves and pressed her palms flat against the worn oak table. The prayer book she always carried had slipped from under her arm somewhere, still on the garden path, probably, lying in the gravel like evidence of her complete unravelling. She was going to be dismissed, obviously, clearly. A woman who shouts at the Duke in his own garden does not remain employed in his household. The mathematics of it were simple and final. Mrs. Graves appeared in the doorway. The ring of iron keys at her waist clinked once against the brass chain as she paused, her silver-grey hair pulled tight in its low bun, her pale blue eyes steady behind those small, round, brass-rimmed spectacles. She took in Eleanor's flushed face, the disordered roses in the basket, the absence of the prayer book. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, with her hands clasped before her and her head tilted at that particular observing angle, he did not seem displeased. The keys clinked again as she turned and walked away. Measured pace, never hurrying. Eleanor stared after her,
The single shallow dimple on her right cheek appeared and vanished as her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again on nothing. The next morning broke grey and soft over Thornfield. Mist clung to the lower gardens.
The breakfast room, east-facing, its wallpaper faded to the colour of weak tea where decades of morning sun had bleached it, had seen only Lady Constance for the better part of 3 weeks. She took her toast and her chocolate there alone, the ivory cameo pinned at her throat, catching what thin light came through the tall windows, her white hair immaculate in its upswept coiffure. So when the door opened and her son appeared, charcoal coat, high-collared white shirt, that deliberate stride carrying him to the sideboard as though he had done this every morning of his life, Lady Constance raised her bone-handled lorgnette to her sharp hazel eye. She held it there. The beauty mark above her lip seemed to sharpen with her expression, the way a question mark appears at the end of a sentence you already know the answer to. He ignored this, poured his coffee, sat. Lady Constance lowered the lorgnette, said nothing, returned to her toast, but her thin, arched brows did not come down for a full minute. That morning, Eleanor read aloud in the morning room, as she had done every day since her arrival. Cooper's verse, the long pastoral passages Lady Constance favoured, her voice carrying through the half-open door and down the corridor with its particular quality of unperformance. She read as if the words were for the page alone, as if she sat in an empty room. She was aware, now, that the corridor was not empty. She could not have said how she knew. A presence, a stillness, the quality of silence that belongs to someone listening rather than merely not speaking. The Duke stood somewhere beyond that door. She was certain of it, in the way one is certain of weather. Her voice did not waver. Her pale green eyes stayed on the page. The tortoise-shell comb held. She read as if no one was listening, and that, precisely that, was what held him there. The pattern took root like something planted. Each morning, the Duke in adjacent rooms. The library, where the fire was always too hot. The study, where estate letters piled on the mahogany desk. The corridor, where his tall boots made no sound on the carpet. Each morning, Eleanor reading, or sorting the morning room flowers, or returning Lady Constance's book to its shelf. Each morning, the careful performance of two people not acknowledging each other while the entire household watched. Mrs. Graves knew. The footman knew. The kitchen maid who brought the morning chocolate knew. The gardener who saw His Grace cross the same path at the same hour for 5 consecutive days, he knew too. One afternoon, alone at his desk, the Duke sat with a letter unread before him. Obligations, the estate's accounts, a proposal from Lord Ashworth regarding drainage rights on the North Fields. His thumb turned the signet ring. 1 rotation, 2, 3, and the faint birthmark on his right inner wrist showed where his cuff had come undone. He stared at the page and saw nothing written there. The loneliness he had organised into routine, the weight of title and expectation in empty rooms. It sat in his chest like a stone he had swallowed so long ago he'd forgotten it was not part of him. Down the corridor, Eleanor's voice carried. Faint. Steady. Reading to no one who would admit to listening. Lady Constance sat in her chair by the window that evening, teacup balanced on its saucer, her sharp hazel eyes following her son's figure as he crossed the garden toward the library for the 3rd consecutive morning at exactly the hour Eleanor read aloud. Mrs. Graves stood beside her,
keys silent for once. The dowager lifted her lorgnette, not to see better, but to make a point of seeing. He has never once cared about poetry before. Not once in 31 years. Mr. Reginald Hale arrives at Thornfield 3 days later, and you can smell the ambition on him like cologne applied with too heavy a hand. He comes in a polished black carriage, 4 matched bays, livery so crisp it might have been sewn that morning. His estate, Ashgrove Park, sits adjacent to Thornfield's eastern boundary, close enough that his housekeeper's gossip network operates with the efficiency of a military dispatch. He has heard about the new reader. He has heard she is young, unmarried, and possesses a voice that makes Lady Constance request additional chapters. He has done his arithmetic. Hale himself is handsome, in that way certain men are handsome, symmetrical, maintained, entirely without surprise. Sandy hair combed precisely to the left, blue eyes that assess value the moment they land on something, a jaw that photographs well and says nothing about character. He wears a dove-grey coat cut to emphasize shoulders that are adequate, not imposing, and his boots gleam with the particular shine of a man who has never walked through mud he didn't choose. He calls on Lady Constance. Of course he does. That is the correct door to knock upon. But when he is shown into the morning room where the Dowager Duchess sits with Eleanor in her cream muslin, the tortoise-shell comb holding back those honey-blonde waves, the worn prayer book resting on the side table beside her tea, Hale's attention lands on the younger woman and stays there with the subtlety of a dog spotting a rabbit. "Miss Ashford," he says after the introductions. "I understand you read beautifully. One hears it spoken of across 2 parishes." Eleanor looks up from the cup she is holding. Her pale green eyes register him with the same measured calm she offers the weather. "That is kind," she says, "though I suspect 2 parishes have very little else to discuss." And there it is. That plainness, that complete absence of flutter or gratitude. Hale blinks, just once, just barely, because he is a man accustomed to women receiving his compliments like gifts. He is accustomed to being delightful. Eleanor Ashford treats him like a neighbour who has dropped in unannounced, which is precisely what he is. He tries again over the next quarter hour, compliments her taste in literature, as she read the newest volume from London, an invitation to walk his grounds. The lime avenue is particularly fine this time of year, and his gardener has done remarkable things with the south border. Each offering is correct, polished, delivered with the confidence of a man who believes himself generous for extending attention downward. Eleanor is polite. She answers his questions. She does not lean forward. She does not laugh at things that are not funny. The single, shallow dimple on her right cheek never appears because she never smiles beyond what courtesy requires. Hale does not know what to do with this. You can see it in the way he adjusts his cuffs, recrosses his legs, glances toward Lady Constance as if seeking confirmation that his charm has been received and simply requires a moment to take effect. It hasn't. It won't. Now, here is what matters. The Duke is not in the morning room. He is in his study across the corridor, door open precisely 4 inches, enough to hear the timbre of voices without distinguishing words. Mrs. Graves passes the study twice during Hale's visit. The first time, the Duke stands at his window, one hand clasped behind his back in that military straight posture, the heavy gold signet ring turning and turning beneath his thumb. The second time, 14 minutes later, the ring is still turning, but faster now. His jaw has set into something architectural. His grey-blue eyes fix on a point in the middle distance that contains, one suspects, the image of a sandy-haired man sitting too close to a woman in cream muslin. He says nothing. Not to Mrs. Graves, not to anyone. But when Hale's carriage finally departs, an hour and 12 minutes after arrival, which is 22 minutes longer than propriety strictly requires, the Duke's study door closes with a sound that carries down the corridor. Not a slam. Worse than a slam. A firm, deliberate pull that speaks of a man containing something he refuses to name. Mrs. Graves pauses in the hallway. Her pale blue eyes, sharp behind those small, round, brass-rimmed spectacles, rest on the closed door for 3 full seconds. The iron keys at her waist do not clink. She is perfectly still. Then she moves on, her measured pace unhurried, her face revealing nothing except the faintest suggestion, around the deep laugh lines framing her mouth, of a woman who has just confirmed a suspicion. That evening, Lady Constance delivers her verdict. She is seated in her usual chair, the plum silk gown catching the firelight, the ivory cameo at her throat gleaming as she lifts her bone-handled lorgnette and lets it fall again, a gesture that functions, in her vocabulary, as a period at the end of a sentence. Mr. Hale is the sort of man who compliments a woman's reading voice while having no opinion whatsoever about what was read. One line. Devastating. Final. She returns to her needlework and does not mention him again. If you've been waiting for the moment everything changes, this is it. That evening in the library, 8 o'clock. The fire burning in its usual excessive fashion, the warmth pressing against the bookshelves, the amber light pooling on the carpet. Eleanor sits in her customary chair, the one nearest the lamp, with the volume of verse open across her knees. Lady Constance occupies her position by the far wall, eyes half closed, listening. The corridor outside is empty. For the first time in weeks, no shadow darkens the gap beneath the door. No quiet breathing marks the hallway. Because tonight, the Duke does not listen from the corridor. He sits in the room, in the chair nearest hers. 3 feet of warm air between his sleeve and her shoulder. Eleanor looks up. The tortoiseshell comb catches the firelight. Her pale green eyes meet his grey-blue ones for a full 3 seconds, long enough to feel the weight of every morning in the garden, every almost meeting in the hall, every hour he spent on the other side of a door. She looks back at the page. She continues reading. Her voice does not change. His breathing does. He says nothing. He does not need to. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried not by the usual post, but by a private courier in a mud-splattered coat who waited in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor. Mrs. Graves took it from him on a silver tray, her ring of iron keys silent for once against her hip, as though even they understood that some deliveries require stillness. The Duke read it in his study with the door locked. 14 pages, dense legal script, numbers that told a story his father had spent 20 years hiding beneath charm and good tailoring. Gambling debts. Not the gentlemanly kind whispered about over port, but the desperate, compounding kind that eat through stone walls and mahogany floors. Poor investments in colonial ventures that never returned a shilling. Promissory notes signed with a flourish by a man who believed tomorrow would always be more generous than today. Tomorrow had finally arrived, and it brought nothing but creditors. The estate, Thornfield, with its 47 rooms and its garden where the roses were finally blooming again, its library where the fire was always too hot, its morning room where the eastern light fell across Lady Constance's hands, could not cover the sum. Not the rents, not the timber rights, not the land itself, if sold piecemeal over a decade. The late Duke had been that thorough in his ruin, that committed to the performance of wealth while the foundation crumbled beneath. 3 days later, the solicitor came. A thin man named Pemberton, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that reflected the study's lamp so you could never quite see his eyes. He spread papers across the Duke's desk, the same desk where Eleanor's prayer book had once rested, forgotten after a morning visit. And he spoke in the careful, measured tone of a man delivering a death sentence he considers merely administrative. The Bancroft heiress, Miss Amelia Bancroft, 22, fortune of £60,000, inherited from a grandfather in trade. She was willing, her family was eager. The match would resolve everything. Every debt, every lien, every threatening letter from every solicitor's office in London. It was sensible. It was clean. It was the obvious solution, laid out in columns that added up perfectly. It was empty. And Henry Ashworth, Duke of Thornfield, sat behind his desk with his signet ring turning beneath his thumb, turning and turning, and said nothing at all. After that, he disappeared. Not from the house. His boots still stood in the hall, his coat still hung on its hook, but from the life of it. The corridor outside the library fell silent in the evenings. The chair nearest Eleanor's sat empty during readings. The book he had left open on the side table, a volume of Cooper's poetry, spine cracked at a page about gardens, remained untouched for 4 days, then 5, then 6. A thin layer of dust settled on its pages. Mrs. Graves did not move it. No one did. Eleanor read to silence now. Her voice carried through the library's warm air, past the too-hot fire, past Lady Constance's ivory cameo brooch gleaming at her throat, and landed nowhere. The dowager listened with her lorgnette resting in her lap, her hazel eyes sharp but newly shadowed, and neither woman spoke of the absence that filled the room like cold water rising. Eleanor did not ask what had changed. That was the thing about her, the thing that made this worse, made everything worse. She simply continued. The roses in the garden received her attention each morning, her honey-blonde hair half-pinned with its tortoiseshell comb, flour sometimes still on her sleeve from helping cook with the bread she had no obligation to help with. She wrote her letters at the small desk in the morning room, her pale green eyes steady on the page, her prayer book set beside her like a talisman. She tended what was before her. She did not chase what had withdrawn. But she noticed. Of course she noticed. The way a room feels different when someone who filled it has emptied themselves from it. The way silence has a different texture when it's chosen rather than natural. Mrs. Graves found Eleanor in the kitchen garden one afternoon, pulling spent herbs from the bed with bare hands, her brown leather half-boots dark with soil. The housekeeper stood at the garden gate with her hands clasped before her silver-grey bun catching the thin October light, her pale blue eyes careful behind those small, round, brass-rimmed spectacles. "His Grace has much weighing on him," she said, measured, precise. "The estate requires arrangements." That pause, that single breath between requires and arrangements. It carried 30 years of service, of watching this family bend and recover and bend again. It carried the specific weight of a word chosen over a dozen worse ones. Eleanor's hands stilled in the soil, her chin lifted. She said nothing. But the shallow dimple on her right cheek, the one that appeared when she spoke, did not appear, because she pressed her lips together and returned to the herbs. Then Hale returned. Damn him. Sir Christopher Hale, riding up the drive on his handsome bay horse with his handsome symmetrical face and his handsome predictable proposal. This time he didn't bother with subtlety. He presented himself to Lady Constance in the morning room with all the ceremony of a man filing a deed at the county office. A formal request to court Miss Ashford. Correct in every particular. Generous in his terms. A house in Suffolk, an income of £800 a year, a life of comfortable irrelevance stretching out like a well-maintained road to nowhere. Lady Constance received him with her chin elevated and her bone-handled lorgnette raised, and she said neither yes nor no, because the answer was not hers to give. But her thin, arched brows drew together in a way that made Hale shift his weight from one foot to the other, and when he left, she did not watch him go. That evening, Eleanor found the Dowager in the morning room, where the eastern light had long since faded to grey. Lady Constance sat in her usual chair, but her posture, that perfect erect spine, had curved forward. Her white hair, elegant in its upswept coiffure, pinned with its jet comb, caught the last of the firelight. Her hands, age-spotted, trembling, lay open in her lap, and her sharp hazel eyes were wet. She was weeping, silently. The kind of weeping that has no performance in it, no audience intended, no comfort sought. The kind that comes from watching a pattern repeat, watching your son prepare to do exactly what his father did, marry for money, marry for duty, marry for everything except the one thing that matters. 30 years she had endured that arithmetic. 30 years of sensible arrangements and empty rooms. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her prayer book clutched under her left arm, her shoulders drawn slightly inward, and she did not speak. She waited. Lady Constance looked up. One hand rose to touch the ivory cameo at her throat, a habit, a comfort, a thing to hold when everything else is falling. "He means to sacrifice himself," she said. Her voice barely carried. "That is all he has ever known how to do." The terrible plan forms in the silence of his study at 2 a.m. Not marriage to the heiress. Something stranger. Something that would make any rational man question his sanity. He will stage his own death. Now look, before you think this is some melodramatic nonsense from a man with too much money and too little sense, understand the reasoning. A lifetime. An entire lifetime of being valued only for the land beneath his boots, the title before his name, the fortune in the ledgers. A father who taught him, with cold precision and daily repetition, that duty replaces feeling, that a duke is not a man. A duke is a function. And Henry Ashworth, standing at that dark window with the signet ring turning slowly under his thumb, needs to know one thing before he signs away his remaining years to a woman chosen by solicitors. Does anyone at Thornfield mourn the man, or only the title? One person. That's all he needs. One. The staging is swift and surgical. A riding accident, his horse returning without him, a trusted servant delivering the news with convincing horror. A closed coffin. No viewing. A swift burial, as befitting a man whose injuries were too grievous for display. The solicitor is informed by letter. The household is told by Mrs. Graves herself, her voice steady and professional as she gathers the staff in the servants' hall. But here's the crucial thing. Lady Constance is not told. His own mother. She believes it entirely. That detail should tell you everything about what kind of desperation drives a man to this. He needs the grief to be real. He needs to watch it and know it is not performance. And so his mother, 68 years old, white hair pinned with that jet comb, hazel eyes sharp enough to cut glass, receives the news like a blade between the ribs. She does not scream. She sits perfectly erect in her chair, one hand on the armrest, the other holding the lorgnette she will not raise for 2 full days. She simply closes her eyes and does not open her door again. The funeral is held on a grey Thursday. The church where the stone holds cold even in July. Half the county attends. Tenants, neighbours, men who owed him political favours, women who had hoped for his hand. They fill the pews with appropriate solemnity and appropriate handkerchiefs. Eleanor stands at the back. Grey wool pelisse buttoned to the throat. The worn prayer book pressed against her chest with both hands, held the way a person holds the last solid thing in a sinking room. Her honey-blonde hair, half pinned with the tortoiseshell comb, loose waves falling against her shoulders, pale green eyes fixed forward. She does not weep, not publicly. Her face is absolutely still, the kind of stillness that looks like composure from 20 feet away and looks like devastation from 3. That stillness costs her everything. The household grieves in its own language. Mrs. Graves walks the corridors that evening, and her keys, the iron ring on the brass chain that has clinked softly with every step for 30 years, are silent. She holds them in her fist, grips them until the metal bites her palm. The sound of those keys was the heartbeat of Thornfield. Their silence is the house holding its breath. Lady Constance does not leave her room for 2 days. Meals are brought. Meals are returned untouched. The ivory cameo brooch stays pinned at her throat because she has not undressed. She sits in the chair by the window and watches the garden where her son used to walk, and she is, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, simply old. And Eleanor continues. She reads aloud in the library at the appointed hour. The chair across from her is empty. She reads to it anyway. Her voice steady, her posture unchanged, shoulders slightly drawn inward, chin lifted, the prayer book set beside her on the side table. She tends the roses in the east garden, the ones she planted herself, pruning with careful hands while the November wind pulls at her ribbon. She writes letters. She does not send them. The routine holds her together like stitching holds a wound. Remove one thread and everything opens. Now, the Duke. Henry Ashworth, hidden in the gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the estate, a single room with a cold hearth and a narrow bed, watches from a distance. Charcoal greatcoat traded for a rough wool jacket. The signet ring removed, tucked into his breast pocket where he can feel its weight against his chest. Grey-blue eyes tracking movement across the grounds with the focus of a man who has bet everything on what he will see. He sees Hale arrive on the 3rd day. Immaculate, sympathetic, a letter of condolence in one hand and a renewed offer of courtship barely concealed in the other. The man walks up the gravel drive with the confident stride of someone who believes grief makes women pliable. Son of a bitch didn't even wait a week. From the cottage window, through bare November branches,
Henry watches Eleanor receive Hale in the morning room. He cannot hear the words. He does not need to. The conversation lasts 4 minutes. Hale emerges looking not angry exactly, confused. The way a man looks when a door he expected to open simply doesn't. Eleanor has declined. No explanation offered. No excuse given. Just no. Henry's hand finds the ring in his pocket. Turns it. Once. Twice. If you've been waiting for the moment something cracks open in this man, it's close. But not yet. Dawn of the 3rd day after the funeral. The sky is pewter and pink at its lowest edge. Frost on the grass. The kind of cold that makes breath visible and silence louder. Eleanor walks alone to the churchyard. The sturdy brown half-boots leave prints in the frozen dew. The prayer book is tucked under her left arm, always the left arm, its leather cover soft and dark from years of handling. The faint birthmark below her left ear catches the earliest light as she tilts her head, reading the stone. His name, his dates, a line about duty she did not choose and would not have chosen. She kneels at the fresh earth. The grey police pools around her on the cold ground. She opens her mouth, and she begins to speak to him as if he can hear her.
I noticed you in the corridor. Her voice barely rises above the morning. The gravestone is dark with dew, the letters of his name cut deep into grey limestone, and Eleanor kneels before it with her dove-grey pelisse pooling against the wet grass, her prayer book set carefully beside her left knee. The tortoiseshell comb holds back most of her honey-blonde waves, but a few strands have come loose at her temples, trembling in the thin November air. Her pale green eyes are fixed on the stone, as though it might answer. The first time, the second, every time after that. She presses her clasped hands tighter together. Her knuckles go white. The birthmark below her left ear is exposed to the cold. She hasn't wrapped a scarf today, hasn't thought to protect herself from anything as simple as weather. I knew you were listening. I could hear you breathing. Not loudly, you were careful about it, always careful. But the floorboard outside your mother's door has that particular creak, and you never learned which side of it to step on. A pause. The churchyard is empty. Dawn hasn't fully committed to the sky. It lingers in shades of iron and lavender above the yew trees at the eastern boundary, and the rooks haven't started yet. And somewhere beyond the wall, a sheep coughs in the fog. I read differently when I knew you were there. The dimple on her right cheek flickers. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of something she's admitting to herself for the first time. Not better. I didn't perform for you. I wouldn't have known how. But more carefully, as if the words mattered more because someone was receiving them, because you were receiving them. I gave them more weight because I knew they would land somewhere. She unfolds her hands, refolds them. The pearl buttons at her bodice catch the first weak shaft of genuine light, and she looks down at them, as if surprised to find herself wearing clothes at all, existing in a body, being a person in a world that still insists on continuing without him in it. I loved the way you handed back the rose. Now her voice thickens, just slightly, just enough. You wouldn't meet my eyes. You held it out, between your first and second finger, like a pen, like something you'd been reading rather than holding, and you looked at the garden wall as though it contained something fascinating, as though you hadn't crossed 30 feet of gravel specifically to return a flower I hadn't asked for. Her chin lifts, that characteristic lift, not pride exactly, but the refusal to let gravity have her. I loved the evening in the library when you sat for an hour and said nothing. Not a single word. You turned your ring and you watched the fire, and I mended your mother's shawl, and neither of us spoke, and it was the finest hour of my life. The absolute finest. And you never knew. The freckles across her nose are vivid in the cold. She looks young and ancient at the same time. 24 years old and carrying the weight of a grief that belongs to women twice her age. You changed the temperature of every room you entered. Did you know that? The air shifted. I could feel you arrive before I saw you. In the morning room, that warmth wasn't the east-facing windows. It was you standing in the doorway, deciding whether you had sufficient excuse to come in. She draws a breath that shudders at its edges. I would not have said any of this to your face. It was not my place. You would have married well, someone suitable, someone whose father didn't die owing £14 to a linen draper, someone who didn't arrive at your house carrying everything she owned in a single trunk. And I would have gone back to my aunt's cottage in Devonshire, and I would have remembered you quietly, and that would have been the whole of it. The whole of my love. Quiet. Kept. Mine. The prayer book sits untouched beside her. Its leather cover is cracked at the spine. She has held it 10,000 times, and today she cannot bring herself to open it, because nothing written inside is as true as what she is saying now. You deserve to know that someone saw you. A voice steadies, firms, becomes the voice that read poetry aloud to a dying woman while a man stood in a corridor with his hand against the wall and his eyes closed. Not the title, not the estate, not the 12,000 a year, or the seat in Lord's, or the carriage, or the name. You, the man who listened to poetry from a corridor because he could not bring himself to sit in the room and admit he wanted to. She places one hand flat against the top of the gravestone, her fingers spread. The cold of it bites into her palm, and she does not pull away. That is who I loved. That is who I will always have loved. The man who could not enter the room. And she is done. She has emptied herself against this stone. She kneels in the wet grass with her hand on his name, and nothing left inside her chest but the dull echo of what used to be there. Beyond the yew trees, 20 feet back, hidden by the thick, dark curtain of ancient branches, a hand grips bark until the knuckles crack. A heavy gold signet ring presses into the wood, leaving a crescent mark in the soft moss. He has not breathed in so long that the edges of his vision have gone dark and sparkling, the way a room looks when you stand too quickly, and his chest burns with the specific pain of a man who has just discovered the cost of his own miscalculation. Not whether anyone cared. That was never the question. He sees that now. The question was what it meant to discover it like this. The cruelty of it. The staggering arrogance of a man who arranges his own disappearance without considering who might kneel at the result. His boot shifts. The weight transfers. A twig, dry, November brittle, thin as a finger bone, snaps beneath his heel. The sound crosses the churchyard like a pistol shot. Eleanor goes silent. Her hand lifts from the stone. She turns. And there he is, pale, unshaven, alive, standing at the edge of the tree line with an expression she has never seen on his face before. The prayer book slips from her fingers. It hits the grass with the soft thud of a thing released without thought, without decision. Eleanor stares at him, pale, unshaven, alive, and she does not scream. She does not run. She says one word, his Christian name. Henry. Just that. A word she has never used before, spoken like an accusation. And then the shock dissolves. Not into relief,
not into joy, into fury. Her voice rises, the first time, the only time it has ever risen in this garden, in this house, in his presence. The pale green eyes go bright and hard. Her shoulders, usually drawn slightly inward, pull back. She is 5 feet 2 inches of absolute wrath standing among the yew trees, and the Duke of Thornfield, 6'2", broad-shouldered, signet ring glinting on his left hand, takes half a step back.
"You let me mourn you."
Each word lands like a stone dropped into still water.
"You let your mother mourn you."
The honey-blonde waves have come loose from the tortoiseshell comb. The birthmark below her left ear pulses with the flush spreading up her throat. She is shaking. Not with grief, with the particular fury of someone who gave something real to a lie. His answer comes stripped of everything. No title, no formality, no careful construction. The grey-blue eyes hold hers, and he speaks the plainest sentence he has ever spoken in his life. "I needed to know if anyone would grieve the man." "You grieved the man." Let that sit. Let that land in your chest the way it lands in hers. He staged his own death, not for the estate, not for the debts, not for political maneuvering, but to answer a question he was too proud to ask while alive. Would anyone miss Henry? Not the Duke, not Thornfield. Him. Her response is equally plain, equally devastating. The single dimple does not appear. Her face is still as carved stone. "That was not yours to test." She bends. She picks up the prayer book, the worn, leather-bound thing she has carried under her left arm every day since she arrived at this house. She tucks it against her side. She turns. She walks away down the garden path with that steady, unhurried gait. And she does not look back. Not once. The Duke does not follow. He stands among the yew trees with one hand clasped behind his back and watches her go. And the small, dark mole at the outer corner of his right eyebrow catches the last of the failing light. He returns to Thornfield that evening. The confession to his mother happens in the drawing room. Lady Constance, in her deep plum silk morning gown, the ivory cameo at her throat, the bone-handled lorgnette resting in her lap. She listens. The sharp hazel eyes do not blink. The white hair in its elegant, upswept coiffure does not move. She is perfectly erect, perfectly still, one hand resting on the arm of her chair. When he finishes, she does not rage, she does not weep. She lifts the lorgnette, slowly, deliberately, and lowers it again. "You are more like your father than you have ever feared." Silence. The clock on the mantel ticks. A log shifts in the grate. Then, after a pause long enough to hold an entire life, "But your father would never have come back." That is all. She returns her gaze to the fire. The conversation is over. The debts are resolved within a fortnight, not through a mercenary marriage, not through the arrangement his father would have made. The London townhouse, the one where the stairs creak on the 4th step, sells for enough to clear the worst of it. The household reduces. 3 footmen instead of 7. The east wing closes. Thornfield becomes smaller, quieter, more honest. The Duke chooses less in order to choose freely.
A smaller life. A real one. 3 days pass in silence. Eleanor reads to Lady Constance each afternoon, her voice clear and unhurried in the morning room, where light comes in from the east. The old woman listens with her eyes closed, one hand on the cameo at her throat. And the corridor outside remains empty. No footsteps pausing, no books left open on hall tables, no transparent excuses. Mrs. Graves notices. Of course she does. The pale blue eyes behind those small, round, brass-rimmed spectacles fix nothing. The ring of iron keys at her waist clinks softly as she pauses in the corridor, the empty corridor, and presses her thin lips together. She says nothing, but she sets an extra cup on the library tea tray the next morning, just in case. On the 4th evening, he finds Eleanor in the rose garden at dusk. The roses that have been neglected since the previous lady of the house died are beginning, just barely, to recover under her care. She is kneeling in the dirt, sturdy brown leather half-boots visible beneath her hem, her hands bare and soil dark. He does not apologize. He has already apologized, and she has already told him it was not enough, and he respects that too much to repeat it. He says simply, "I will be in the library at 9 tomorrow morning. If you wish to read, I will be in the room this time, not the corridor." He turns the heavy gold signet ring with his thumb. He walks away. She comes. 9 o'clock. The library where the fire is always too hot. She sits in the chair by the window. He sits 3 feet away. She opens the book. She reads. He listens, not from the corridor, not from behind a closed door, but here, present, visible. Neither speaks beyond the page. It is enough. It is the beginning. If you've been waiting for the moment everything changes, that was it. Not a declaration, not a grand gesture. A man in a chair, 3 feet away, finally willing to be seen, wanting what he wants. Months later, the same garden path where she scolded him without knowing who he was. Flower on her sleeve that day, the prayer book tucked under her arm, her chin lifted as she told a stranger exactly what she thought of men who trampled rose beds. The same roses, now blooming, full and heavy and pink in the July heat. Eleanor rounds the hedge with her basket, the tortoiseshell comb catching the afternoon sun, the faint birthmark below her left ear visible above the collar of her dress. The single, shallow dimple appears on her right cheek. Because he is there, standing at the edge of the path, with one hand clasped behind his back, the signet ring glinting, the grey-blue eyes steady and warm in a way they never were before her. "You might announce yourself," she says. "Never," he says. The house holds them. The garden holds them. The gravel path, the blooming roses, the library where the fire is always too hot, the corridor where he no longer has to hide. Everything is different. Nothing has changed. That is the point. That has always been the point.